In a bustling city where skyscrapers stretched high and the hum of finance buzzed day and night, the stakes in government and business were always high. Among the many government officials tasked with safeguarding public finances, Mr. Thomas Vin stood out. Known for his meticulous nature and unwavering integrity, Thomas had spent decades ensuring every financial transaction under his purview was transparent, documented, and fair. However, on an otherwise unremarkable afternoon, his world was upended in the most unexpected way. Thomas was preparing his notes for a seminar on public finance reform when a team of plainclothes officers arrived at his office. He was taken aback by their sudden appearance and the cold urgency in their demeanor. Without much explanation, they placed him under arrest. Bewildered and defensive, Thomas demanded an explanation, but the officers only mentioned his alleged involvement in a major fraud case, a crime he knew nothing about. They led him, handcuffed, to a gray-walled interrogation room where he was questioned for hours. During the interrogation, the officers accused Thomas of coordinating a scheme to siphon funds through bogus investments that had been defrauding citizens and businesses alike. Thomas was flabbergasted, struggling to comprehend how he had come to be mistaken for a mastermind of financial crime. The investigation officers seemed resolute in their belief, bringing up files, financial statements, and snippets of circumstantial evidence that linked his name, his very identity, to the scheme. It was a bitter irony. His entire career had been built on enforcing financial transparency and ethical conduct, and now he sat accused of the very transgressions he had dedicated himself to preventing. Hours stretched on as Thomas attempted to convince the officers of his innocence. He asked for his records, alibis, and documents to be examined, laying out proof after proof that his involvement was impossible. He pointed out discrepancies in their evidence, highlighting times and dates that conflicted with his documented whereabouts. He reminded them of his role in government oversight, of the public events he had attended that left no room for clandestine activities. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, his alibis and evidence aligned well enough to cast doubt on the officers' accusations. As the truth unraveled, so did the officers' confidence in their case against him. Thomas had been wrongfully detained due to a superficial connection, a shared name with one of the actual suspects involved in the fraudulent scheme. The officers had acted on hastily gathered evidence without thoroughly investigating the link, leading them to accuse the wrong man. It was an oversight born out of haste, an eagerness to resolve the high-profile case that had shaken public trust. Though they ultimately released him and apologized, Thomas's relief was mingled with an intense sense of injustice and frustration. The hours he spent wrongfully accused had not only disrupted his personal and professional life, but had also shaken his trust in the very system he had once believed in. As he walked out of the police station, the events replayed in his mind, the questions they asked, the accusations they leveled, the disbelief in his voice as he defended his innocence. He could have easily been another statistic, another wrongly accused man without the resources or connections to clear his name. Determined to turn his experience into a catalyst for change, Thomas didn't simply move on. He began a campaign to review the procedures that had led to his wrongful arrest. His request was simple yet profound: a thorough audit of the entire investigative process. He wanted assurances that other innocent people wouldn't suffer the way he had, that the process would be corrected to prevent future mistakes. News of Thomas's wrongful detention spread quickly, sparking public debate. People voiced concerns over the procedures used by law enforcement, questioning how a seasoned official could be apprehended based on such flimsy evidence. The public outcry placed tremendous pressure on the police department, and they had no choice but to initiate a formal review. Officers involved in Thomas's case were asked to provide detailed accounts of their actions, the investigative methods they used, and the decision-making process that led to his arrest. As days turned into weeks, the review committee uncovered serious flaws in the investigation's methodology. The officers had failed to conduct thorough background checks, and they had ignored inconsistencies in their initial findings. The investigation process itself was found to be riddled with shortcuts, pressured by a high-stakes timeline and expectations for swift justice. The case revealed systemic issues that extended beyond Thomas's arrest, issues that could potentially have led to countless other wrongful accusations. Throughout the review process, Thomas remained an active voice. He spoke publicly about the emotional toll of his experience and the importance of protecting the innocent within the justice system. He emphasized that his story wasn't unique. It was a cautionary tale about the consequences of negligence in law enforcement. As he became the public face of this issue, more individuals began to share their own experiences with flawed investigations. His campaign resonated deeply, and he soon had the support of legal advocates, journalists, and concerned citizens. Under growing public scrutiny, the police department acknowledged the need for reform. Thomas's case became the impetus for implementing stricter guidelines in evidence collection and verification. Officers were required to attend additional training on investigatory integrity, focusing on eliminating biases and safeguarding against wrongful accusations. The department introduced new checks and balances to prevent premature arrests based on superficial evidence, ensuring that every case would be thoroughly vetted before any formal action was taken. Despite these advancements, Thomas's journey was far from over. His experience had uncovered a larger problem, a flaw within the system that couldn't be fixed overnight. He continued his campaign, advocating for a permanent independent oversight body to monitor the justice system and provide support for those wrongfully accused. He wanted more than just a reactionary fix. He sought a fundamental shift in how investigations were conducted. This call for reform extended beyond his city, drawing interest from lawmakers who saw potential in applying these changes at a national level. Over time, Thomas became a prominent advocate for judicial accountability, frequently speaking at public forums, legal conventions, and media outlets. His story became a symbol of resilience and hope, a testament to the strength required to confront an institution with the courage to demand better. His journey encouraged a generation of citizens to believe in the power of change, to recognize that even the most deeply rooted systems could be improved with persistence and purpose. Yet, as he continued his work, Thomas knew there would always be resistance. For every person who supported his cause, there were others who viewed him as an adversary. Within law enforcement, not everyone agreed with his calls for change. Some feared that heightened scrutiny would limit their ability to operate effectively, while others felt that the reforms went too far. Thomas faced criticism from officials who believed he was overstepping, that he was placing undue pressure on a system already burdened by public expectations. But he understood that the journey toward justice was rarely without opposition. As the months wore on, Thomas's journey toward reform took on new dimensions. He had gained widespread attention, but with it came unforeseen challenges. Opposition from some officials grew louder, and the police department's leadership expressed frustration with the scrutiny. For some, Thomas's reforms represented a threat to their long-held practices. For others, it was simply inconvenient. Yet, the momentum for change could not be easily dismissed. Citizens, encouraged by Thomas's determination, organized rallies, demanding accountability and transparency. Public pressure mounted, and soon, city councils and community leaders became involved, promising to support new protocols and investigative procedures. Thomas was not without allies, though. Advocacy groups, journalists, and citizens' rights organizations reached out to him, offering support and resources. They shared stories of others who had faced similar experiences, painting a picture of a flawed system that too often erred on the side of expedience over thoroughness. These allies helped Thomas organize a coalition, a united front aimed at pushing reform through legislative means. Their goal was ambitious: to propose a formal, legally binding charter that would overhaul investigative protocols, establishing clear guidelines for due process, evidence evaluation, and accountability. As Thomas led this coalition, he encountered yet another layer of resistance. Lobbyists representing powerful interests began pushing back, subtly undermining his efforts by raising questions about the feasibility and costs of implementing the proposed reforms. They argued that excessive procedural requirements could bog down law enforcement, making it difficult to act swiftly in cases where time was critical. Thomas understood their concerns, but believed that precision and care were essential, especially when people's lives and reputations hung in the balance. To address these concerns, Thomas and his team worked tirelessly to fine-tune their proposals, balancing the need for thorough investigation with the urgency of law enforcement work. They conducted pilot studies and commissioned expert reviews, demonstrating how these reforms could be integrated without hampering efficiency. It was a painstaking process, requiring compromise, negotiation, and the painstaking collection of data to support their claims. Amid the intense back and forth, Thomas found himself drawn deeper into the world of policy making than he had ever intended. Meetings with legislators, town halls, interviews with journalists. It became a cycle that consumed his days and nights. His once simple life as a finance official had transformed into a relentless pursuit of justice, a calling that was as exhausting as it was fulfilling. He watched as his efforts began to ripple outward, affecting other cities, sparking discussions on investigative integrity across the country. But despite his successes, Thomas knew the road ahead was long. Change at such a fundamental level was slow, and setbacks were inevitable. Each time a small victory was won, a reform passed, a protocol amended, new obstacles appeared, new questions arose. Some of his allies grew weary, questioning if the fight could truly make a lasting impact. Yet Thomas, steadfast as ever, continued forward, convinced that even the smallest shifts in justice were worth pursuing. He had come to realize that his journey might not have a clear end, that it might stretch on indefinitely, evolving as each new layer of resistance, each unforeseen challenge emerged. The pursuit of fairness, he understood now, was not a destination but a path, one that would require constant vigilance, dedication, and above all, hope. And so, with each new day, he continued forward, unwavering in his mission to make the justice system a force for good. As Thomas's journey unfolded, his work began attracting attention from beyond his city. Journalists from national newspapers reached out, intrigued by the unlikely story of a finance official turned reform advocate. Articles were published that detailed his wrongful detention and the campaign he had since launched to overhaul investigative protocols. Soon, other officials who had once dismissed his efforts began to take notice, realizing that this movement had grown far beyond the confines of a single case. Across the country, Thomas was becoming a symbol of resilience and accountability, an inspiration to those who had suffered at the hands of an imperfect system. With his growing influence, Thomas was invited to speak at conferences on law enforcement, justice, and policy reform. Each speech he delivered was met with applause and questions. Questions about how his vision of accountability could be implemented at a national level, about the feasibility of comprehensive oversight in a system often resistant to change. He spoke with conviction, sharing stories of individuals who had been impacted by procedural errors, not only inspiring the audience, but also building connections with reform-minded officials and activists from other regions. They, too, began advocating for similar changes, drawing from Thomas's model to create blueprints that could be adapted to their own local contexts. Despite the groundswell of support, the road ahead was strewn with new challenges. Thomas's every move was scrutinized, both by allies who saw him as a beacon of change and by skeptics who feared the implications of his reforms. For every supporter, there were critics within law enforcement who resented his message, who argued that his campaign endangered the efficiency of their work. Some officials even launched a counter-campaign, accusing Thomas of undermining the authority of law enforcement, of sowing distrust in the institutions that had long upheld public safety. They painted his movement as a threat to tradition, warning that the push for reform would lead to weakened policies and increased crime. In response, Thomas maintained his composure, using each critique as an opportunity to underscore the importance of accountability. He hosted forums and public meetings where he invited police officers, victims of wrongful accusations, and community members to share their perspectives. These discussions were tense but invaluable, as they allowed Thomas to bridge gaps, to address misunderstandings and emphasize that his goal was not to weaken law enforcement, but to strengthen it by restoring public trust. He believed that a system that was fairer, more transparent, would ultimately be stronger, even if getting there meant challenging deeply ingrained practices. Slowly, some in law enforcement began to see the value of his work. Officers who had witnessed firsthand the consequences of rushed investigations, the mistakes that haunted not only the accused but also the officers themselves, began to speak up in support of Thomas's reforms. A small coalition of forward-thinking officers joined his cause, lending their voices to the movement. They argued that Thomas's vision was not about restricting law enforcement, but about creating a culture where accuracy and justice went hand in hand, where the goal was not simply to close cases quickly, but to close them correctly. The impact of his movement rippled out further than he had anticipated. In his city and beyond, local governments began allocating funds to improve investigative training and increase oversight. Universities started incorporating his case study into their criminal justice curricula, teaching future officers about the ethical dimensions of law enforcement and the importance of due diligence. Thomas was invited to collaborate on research projects with scholars and policy experts, exploring new methods for preventing wrongful accusations and ensuring investigative integrity. His story became a cornerstone in discussions on justice, his experience a reminder of what could happen when systems prioritize speed over thoroughness. Yet, as these victories accumulated, Thomas remained aware of the immense work still to be done. Each reform passed, each law amended, was a step forward, but the journey seemed endless. There were still voices resisting change, still cases of wrongful detentions surfacing despite the new protocols. The fight for justice, he realized, was a constant balancing act, one that required tireless vigilance, not only from him but from everyone involved. He knew he couldn't be everywhere at once, but he hoped that by continuing his work, he could inspire others to take up the torch, to pursue justice with the same fervor. Thomas often found himself working late into the night, drafting policy proposals, consulting with activists, and speaking with victims of wrongful accusations who sought his guidance. The weight of their stories kept him focused, their shared pain a reminder of the purpose behind his efforts. As he delved deeper into reform, he discovered new layers of complexity within the system, realizing that change would require not only better policies, but a transformation in mindset, a shift in how society viewed justice and accountability. As the years passed, Thomas's influence continued to grow, and his campaign evolved into a movement that transcended borders. What had started as a response to a personal injustice became a rallying cry for reform-minded individuals worldwide. He found himself navigating a complex web of relationships, alliances, and partnerships, each with its own challenges and nuances. But through it all, Thomas remained committed to his mission, refusing to settle for anything less than a system that truly upheld justice. The path before him stretched on indefinitely, full of twists and turns, yet he felt no desire to stop. The journey had become his life's work, an endeavor with no clear endpoint, but one that was undeniably worth every step. As he moved forward, he did so with the knowledge that while true justice might remain an elusive goal, each effort to reform, each person he inspired, brought the world closer to the vision he had once imagined in that cold interrogation room. So many years ago, as Thomas's movement expanded, he became a fixture in national debates on law enforcement reform. News channels regularly featured him in interviews, where he discussed not only his personal experience, but also the broader systemic changes needed to prevent similar mistakes. The public's response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life wrote letters, shared their stories, and rallied around his cause. The wrongful accusation he had endured had tapped into a deep well of shared frustration and a desire for accountability, one that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. In the face of this growing wave, officials who had once ignored his calls for reform were forced to take notice. Lawmakers began drafting bills inspired by his proposed policies, bills that required more stringent investigative processes, independent oversight, and mandatory reviews of all cases involving wrongful detentions. Thomas worked closely with these lawmakers, providing insights and advice based on his firsthand experience. He found himself becoming not just an advocate, but a policy advisor, lending his voice and expertise to shape the very laws that would protect others from the mistakes he had endured. However, with each step forward, the pushback became fiercer. Some officials feared that the changes Thomas advocated would open floodgates of legal challenges against past convictions, casting doubt on their legacy. They argued that his movement undermined public confidence in law enforcement, and that by focusing on rare errors, he was ignoring the many cases where justice was correctly served. To them, Thomas's work was a threat to the order they had spent years upholding, a challenge to their authority and methods. Yet Thomas pressed on. He traveled across the country, speaking at universities, town halls, and community centers, building a network of supporters who shared his vision of a justice system that balanced rigor with fairness. He spoke to students who were inspired by his story and who would go on to become the next generation of attorneys, officers, and public officials. These young people were eager to carry his message forward, to embed his lessons in the systems they would one day inherit. With time, Thomas's influence began to reach the highest levels of government. He was invited to testify before national committees on criminal justice reform, where he laid out detailed recommendations for preventing wrongful detentions. His proposals were met with both applause and criticism, yet he remained undeterred, focused on the bigger picture. He argued that reform was not a critique of law enforcement, but a pathway to strengthening it, to making it more respected and effective in the eyes of the public. His words were carefully measured, his tone calm yet impassioned, capturing the attention of even his staunchest critics. Behind the scenes, Thomas's work was exhausting. He spent countless hours reviewing cases, talking to victims, and consulting with legal experts. His days blurred into nights as he moved from meeting to meeting, always on the move, always driven by the memories of his own experience and the stories others had shared. His work took him away from home for weeks at a time. Yet he felt a deep sense of purpose that outweighed the personal sacrifices he was making. He saw himself as part of a much larger story, a wave of change that could reshape how society viewed justice and accountability. But even as his movement gained ground, the journey remained fraught with setbacks. For every reform implemented, there were counter-efforts, delays, and loopholes. Some cities adopted his proposals, only to roll them back under pressure from powerful figures who were resistant to change. New challenges constantly emerged: legal barriers, political opposition, and public fatigue. Reform was never straightforward. It was a continuous struggle, one that required Thomas to be both resilient and adaptable. In quiet moments, Thomas sometimes wondered if his efforts would ever lead to lasting change. He knew that real reform was a slow process, one that would take years, perhaps even generations, to fully unfold. But he had made peace with the idea that he might not see the full fruits of his labor in his lifetime. The work itself was its own reward, a mission that transcended personal recognition or immediate results. As he moved forward, he found himself surrounded by a new generation of advocates who had been inspired by his journey. Young lawyers, activists, and journalists took up his cause, pushing for justice with the same relentless spirit he had shown. Thomas had become a mentor to them, a guide who offered wisdom and encouragement, even as he continued to fight his own battles. He watched as these younger voices brought fresh energy to the movement, carrying his message forward in ways he could never have anticipated. In many ways, Thomas's journey had come full circle. What had started as a deeply personal quest for justice had grown into a nationwide movement, a rallying cry for accountability and reform that showed no signs of stopping. His vision had taken on a life of its own, spreading across communities, crossing borders, and inspiring countless others to believe that change was possible. And though the road before him remained long and winding, he walked it with the conviction that each step was bringing the world closer to the justice he had once only dreamed of. There would always be challenges, always more work to be done. But Thomas embraced the uncertainty, the unending nature of his path. For him, the pursuit of justice was a journey without an end, a commitment to something greater, something worth striving for, no matter how long it took. Today, as Thomas continued his journey, His story rippled out far beyond the city where his ordeal had begun, reaching individuals he would never meet, yet whose lives he unknowingly touched. His speeches became landmarks in the movement for justice reform, shared widely online, broadcast in lectures, and cited in articles. People started movements of their own, creating networks that spanned cities, drawing on his story to ignite reforms in their own communities. Students wrote research papers on his case. Policy think tanks conducted studies inspired by his proposals, and grassroots organizations invited him to consult on local reforms. His vision, once a lone voice against an indifferent system, had woven itself into the very fabric of the public consciousness, becoming a symbol of accountability and integrity. But his journey was far from simple. Thomas's work often required him to face not only opposition from officials, but also the weariness of the very people he sought to help. Some communities had grown disillusioned with the prospect of change, having endured decades of broken promises and unmet demands. Thomas faced skepticism, as well as the painful reality that some people had given up hope that justice could ever be fair. Undeterred, he devoted himself to engaging directly with these communities, visiting neighborhoods where reform felt like a distant ideal, where trust in the system had long eroded. In these conversations, he listened as much as he spoke, absorbing their concerns and incorporating them into his vision for reform. Slowly, the public's faith in the movement rekindled, ignited by Thomas's willingness to meet them where they were, not only in the halls of policy, but in the everyday struggles that shaped their lives. Behind each step, however, lay the relentless demands of his mission. Thomas often worked into the early hours of the morning, poring over policy drafts, reading personal accounts, consulting with experts, and preparing for speeches. He came to understand that the work of reform was a meticulous and sometimes thankless endeavor, involving not only grand ideals, but also the painstaking grind of incremental change. He knew that each small step mattered, that every revised policy, every procedural improvement, was one brick in a foundation of lasting change. Yet, despite his efforts, he sometimes wondered if his work was enough. The resistance was endless. For every victory, there seemed to be a setback, a new obstacle in the way. The path he walked was one of constant recalibration, as he balanced the weight of public expectation with the reality of an entrenched system. But Thomas found support in unexpected places. Individuals within the justice system, investigators, prosecutors, and officers, reached out to him quietly, sharing insights and offering their own ideas for reform. They recognized the flaws within the system, acknowledging the pressure they faced to prioritize swift closures over meticulous investigation. Some of these allies worked in secret, wary of retaliation, but each became a valuable source of insight, helping Thomas understand the inner workings of the system he sought to change. Together, they uncovered pathways to reform that were both impactful and feasible, practical solutions that could gain traction even within a resistant institution. As his work progressed, Thomas found himself evolving. The anger that had once driven him had softened into a steady determination, a tempered resolve that sustained him even in moments of doubt. He understood that true reform was not an overnight victory, but a long, winding journey filled with setbacks and small steps forward. The energy of a single victory, he knew, could only carry the movement so far. What mattered more was the unyielding dedication to the cause, the resilience to continue even when change felt impossible. Years passed, and Thomas's journey stretched onward, becoming more a part of his life with each passing day. His once personal mission had transformed into a calling, one that pulled him deeper into the world of policy and advocacy. He became a mentor to others who were beginning their own fights for justice, sharing his hard-earned wisdom and teaching them to navigate the complexities of reform. And as his influence grew, so did the pressure. He often found himself torn between public expectations and the slow reality of change. Yet he refused to compromise his vision. He knew that real reform would come only if he stayed true to the principles he had fought so hard to uphold. In moments of quiet, he would reflect on how far he had come since that first day of wrongful detention, when he was an innocent man swept up in a system that barely paused to consider his innocence. Now, he stood as a beacon of hope, a reminder that justice was worth pursuing, no matter how difficult the journey. He had become a part of a legacy that transcended him, a force of change that would continue long after he was gone. Thomas's journey soon attracted the attention of international advocacy groups, and his work crossed borders, inspiring reform efforts around the world. He received invitations to speak at conferences from regions grappling with similar issues in their justice systems. Each country had its own version of the problem, each with unique barriers and histories, but the root of the issue, the need for accountability and accuracy in law enforcement, remained the same. Thomas approached each of these opportunities as a chance to learn as well as to teach, adapting his experiences to address the specific challenges of each place he visited. As he traveled, he met others who had endured their own struggles for justice. There were families from rural towns who had lost loved ones due to wrongful convictions, lawyers fighting uphill battles against corrupt systems, and journalists risking their lives to uncover the truth. These encounters reinforced his understanding that his story was not just about him. It was part of a much larger narrative of ordinary people striving against immense odds to demand fairness. His interactions with these individuals deepened his commitment, giving him fresh motivation to continue despite the countless obstacles he faced. In between public appearances and advocacy work, Thomas spent quiet hours poring over case files from those who reached out to him, each one a glimpse into a life disrupted by the justice system's errors. These stories haunted him, keeping him up at night as he wondered how many more lives had been upended by the very system designed to protect them. He became determined to bring these stories into the spotlight, to make them visible so that others could understand the human cost of injustice. Back home, his movement continued to grow, evolving into a vast network of supporters, legal experts, and activists dedicated to reform. With their help, Thomas launched a foundation focused on research and policy development, aiming to create lasting frameworks that would outlive his direct involvement. The foundation worked closely with academic institutions to conduct studies on systemic flaws, collecting data on wrongful detentions, procedural errors, and the socioeconomic impacts of flawed investigations. They published reports that highlighted the pressing need for reform, reports that quickly became reference points in discussions of justice and policing. Despite his growing influence, Thomas was aware that his work was not immune to backlash. He faced ongoing resistance from certain political figures and law enforcement officials who argued that his proposed reforms were impractical or overly idealistic. Some even claimed that his efforts threatened to undermine public safety, stirring fears that his calls for oversight and accountability would weaken law enforcement. Thomas responded to these criticisms with steady resolve, insisting that true public safety could only be achieved through a system that valued accuracy and integrity. Even as these debates raged on, Thomas remained focused on the stories that had inspired him to take up this fight in the first place. He visited communities where people felt alienated from the justice system, speaking directly to those who had lost faith in institutions that had let them down. His presence gave many a renewed sense of hope. Here was someone who understood, someone who was willing to stand with them and demand change. The people he met shared their struggles, their frustrations, and their hopes with him, and he carried their stories with him, each one strengthening his resolve. The foundation expanded its initiatives, offering pro bono legal support for those who had been wrongfully accused, providing training for officers on investigative ethics, and hosting workshops to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the communities they served. These initiatives were not quick fixes. They were designed as long-term efforts, as ways to create lasting cultural shifts within law enforcement. Thomas knew that these changes would be slow, that they would require years, perhaps decades, to fully take root. But he was willing to wait, to continue the work no matter how long it took. As he moved from city to city, speaking to students, lawmakers, and community leaders, Thomas began to notice subtle changes. Laws were being amended, protocols were being rewritten, and more officers were receiving training that emphasized integrity over expediency. He knew these shifts were only the beginning, small ripples in what he hoped would become a wave of change. Yet each victory, no matter how small, reassured him that the movement was growing, that others were taking up the cause with the same passion he had carried since that first fateful day. Through all of this, Thomas found solace in knowing that his journey, though far from over, was part of something much larger than himself. He often reminded himself that justice was not a destination, but an ongoing pursuit, a continuous effort to make the world a fairer place for all. He knew that his work would never truly be complete, that the struggle for accountability and fairness would stretch far beyond his lifetime. But he found peace in the idea that his efforts would lay the groundwork for future generations, that he was helping to build a world where justice was a constant, evolving commitment. With each passing year, Thomas's story became part of the collective consciousness, a reminder of what could be achieved through persistence and integrity. His movement grew into an enduring legacy, one that others would carry forward long after he was gone. And so, Thomas continued onward, each step echoing his unwavering belief that true justice was worth pursuing, no matter how endless the journey seemed. As the years rolled on, Thomas's work became a vast and intricate web of initiatives, collaborations, and partnerships that spanned the country and beyond. His foundation established specialized branches, focusing on different aspects of the justice system: investigative transparency, judicial ethics, community outreach, and restorative justice practices. Each branch grew into a formidable network of advocates, experts, and volunteers, all dedicated to addressing flaws in the system at multiple levels. The Foundation's annual reports became benchmarks for government agencies and law schools, widely circulated as educational tools and catalysts for policy reform. Thomas's influence continued to spread, bringing a steady flow of young professionals, eager to work with him and inspired by his unwavering commitment. These recruits brought new ideas and energy to the movement, and Thomas welcomed them with open arms. He knew that, for change to truly endure, it would need to be passed down to generations who would carry it forward long after he had left. Mentorship became one of his greatest priorities. He poured his time and energy into shaping these future leaders, sharing with them not only his strategies but also his values. The deep sense of empathy and responsibility that had guided his journey. Over time, his work reached into the heart of the legal system itself. Law schools began inviting him to teach special courses on ethics, accountability, and policy reform, creating an entirely new curriculum based on the lessons he had learned. Judges and prosecutors sat in on his seminars, listening as he dissected case studies and detailed the steps necessary to prevent wrongful accusations. Some of the students he taught went on to become public defenders, prosecutors, and policymakers, carrying his teachings into courtrooms and legislative chambers, where they quietly championed his ideals from within the system. Meanwhile, Thomas continued his travels, often going to the most remote areas where trust in the justice system was almost non-existent. These communities welcomed him, not only for his message, but because he listened to them with a genuine intent to understand. He spent days immersed in their stories, learning about the unique challenges they faced and thinking of ways his foundation could support them. Slowly, he helped communities develop their own local networks for accountability, empowering people to advocate for themselves and demand transparency in their towns and cities. These localized efforts grew into a powerful grassroots network, reaching from bustling urban centers to the quietest rural towns, creating a solidarity that transcended geography. With each new initiative, Thomas grew even more determined, but he also began to feel the weight of his work. The strain of traveling, managing a growing organization, and fielding countless requests from around the world was exhausting. Yet, in the quiet hours, when he would look back on the faces of those who had shared their stories with him, he found his resolve strengthening. He understood that every piece of his work, every policy drafted, and every lecture given was a small but vital part of an ongoing journey that would continue, whether he was there to see it through or not. The Foundation's reach expanded into international partnerships, aligning with human rights organizations and justice advocates from around the world. Together, they conducted research on wrongful detentions, held joint conferences, and crafted recommendations for nations seeking to reform their own justice systems. Thomas began to see his journey as part of a global movement, a shared aspiration for fairness and integrity that spanned continents. He traveled to regions facing their own battles with justice, where officials and activists alike looked to his work as a guide for change. As he spoke to these diverse audiences, he felt a profound connection, a bond formed from the shared desire to transform systems that had long gone unchallenged. As his work deepened, Thomas became more reflective. He knew that while progress was steady, the road ahead remained long and fraught with obstacles. Reform was not a single act, but an enduring commitment, a journey that would outlive him. He thought often about the countless lives affected by injustices they could not control, the people whose stories he had carried with him since the beginning. Their stories fueled him, urging him forward even as he aged, even as the demands on his time grew more intense. The Foundation's reputation continued to grow, becoming a beacon for those fighting their own battles for justice. Through its work, Thomas had become a symbol of hope, a testament to the belief that ordinary citizens could reshape the systems that governed their lives. People from all over sought guidance, advice, and solidarity, creating an ever-expanding network of allies bound by a shared commitment to fairness. The Foundation launched mentorship programs, public education campaigns, and advocacy tools that communities could use to advocate for transparency, giving them the means to enact the changes they sought. As the movement evolved, Thomas began to step back, entrusting more of his responsibilities to the capable hands he had trained. He knew that his life's work was no longer solely his. It belonged to a collective effort that had taken root across the world. He continued to offer counsel and guidance, but his focus shifted toward supporting others in carrying the mission forward. He spent more time in quiet contemplation, taking comfort in knowing that the seeds he had planted had grown into a thriving forest of reform, each branch reaching toward a future where justice would no longer be an elusive ideal but a tangible reality. Though his journey was never-ending, Thomas felt a profound peace in the knowledge that his work would live on, carried by those who shared his vision of a world made fairer, not by any single hero but by a collective, tireless pursuit of justice. Thomas continued his work with an ever-growing sense of purpose, but also an awareness of the increasing complexity of his mission. As the Foundation gained international recognition, more and more individuals reached out to him for help. Some were victims of miscarriages of justice, others were whistleblowers, and many were young professionals who wanted to work alongside him to change the system from within. As his network expanded, Thomas realized that the fight for reform was not just about addressing past wrongs, but about building systems capable of preventing those wrongs from happening in the first place. He began to focus more on proactive solutions, developing educational programs for young law enforcement officers and training programs for officials in charge of policy enforcement. He worked closely with universities to incorporate his framework of justice into the curriculum for future lawyers, judges, and investigators. The goal was to instill a deep sense of ethical responsibility in the next generation of legal professionals. But he was under no illusion that these efforts would bear fruit quickly. The changes Thomas envisioned would take decades to fully manifest in any meaningful way. In the meantime, he found himself involved in an increasing number of high-stakes cases. His name was now widely recognized, and as a result, he was called upon to consult on cases of great importance, often at the intersection of politics and justice. He used his platform not only to advocate for individuals wrongfully accused or caught up in bureaucratic missteps, but also to call for broader systemic change. His public speeches had become known for their powerful blend of legal expertise and moral clarity. The public, and even some in law enforcement, looked to him as a figurehead for the future of the justice system. But as his influence grew, so did the personal toll. There were moments when Thomas questioned whether he was doing enough, whether his work was truly making a lasting impact. The public's expectations were high, and there were always those who criticized him for not moving faster or for not having done more. He had become something of a symbol, a person to look to for answers, and with that came an immense pressure to constantly deliver. Despite the stress, Thomas remained steadfast, often retreating to quiet moments of reflection. He sought balance by returning to the grassroots level, visiting the communities that had first inspired him, those places where the justice system was viewed with skepticism or outright fear. These trips reminded him why he had started his mission in the first place. For the people who had no voice, who had been forgotten by the system. His foundation, too, had grown, now operating in several countries and continuing to gather support from people who believed in its cause. Yet, with expansion came its own set of challenges. The work needed to ensure that the organization maintained its core values. Transparency, accountability, fairness became more complex. More resources were needed, more staff, more coordination between various national and international offices. As much as Thomas had wanted to remain at the forefront, the reality of his expanded role meant he was forced to relinquish control over day-to-day operations. The organization ran on its own momentum, but Thomas knew that he had to remain involved, guiding it, even from the background. He began to receive recognition from institutions that had once been skeptical of him. National and international organizations, such as the United Nations and various human rights coalitions, sought his counsel on justice-related issues. Yet, even as these accolades piled up, Thomas was aware of a growing divide between his public persona and the private, internal doubts that gnawed at him. Was this really the change he had envisioned, or had it become something else entirely? The global network that had coalesced around him had its own agenda, its own pressures and expectations, and Thomas sometimes wondered if his original vision had been diluted in the process. He continued to meet with world leaders, advising on policy reforms and providing testimony for legislative changes. He was often called upon to share his thoughts on justice in countries where corruption and abuse of power were rampant. While his work on the international stage was groundbreaking, it was also fraught with frustration. Many of the issues he sought to address were deeply entrenched in cultural and institutional norms, and the changes he advocated for were met with resistance from powerful political figures who had no interest in losing control over the system. Yet, despite these challenges, the work continued. The networks Thomas had built over the years remained strong, and new voices, younger and more dynamic, were emerging within the movement. They took up the mantle in their own ways, advocating for justice through the lens of technology, social media, and global activism. The newer generation was bringing fresh ideas to the table, ideas that Thomas had never imagined, ways of reaching people faster, engaging them on a deeper level, and creating platforms for collective action in real time. Thomas, now older, had seen a shift in how justice was perceived around the world. His earlier battles for recognition and reform seemed like distant memories compared to the challenges the movement now faced. He had become a figurehead not just for legal reform, but for the power of collective action in a modern, interconnected world. And even though his efforts had been instrumental in sparking a global conversation, the struggle for true justice remained. The systems of power, the structures that had always resisted change, had adapted to fight back against the forces of reform. But Thomas never lost hope. His belief in the power of accountability, of continuous work, of never giving up was unwavering. Each new day, each new challenge, reminded him that the work was never done. It was an ongoing battle, one that could never truly be won, but that did not mean it wasn't worth fighting. The fight for justice, Thomas had come to understand, was not about a singular victory, but about the quiet, persistent effort to chip away at injustice, one case, one reform, one voice at a time. As long as he had the strength, he would continue. As the years passed, Thomas found himself more entrenched in the very heart of the global justice reform movement. The ripple effects of his early work had expanded far beyond what he had initially envisioned. His name was synonymous with integrity, fairness, and a relentless pursuit of justice. Yet, as the movement gained momentum, so did the complexity of the challenges that lay ahead. Thomas had always believed that the key to lasting change was not just in legal reform, but in shifting cultural attitudes toward justice. It was one thing to change laws, but it was quite another to change the mindset of entire systems, be it law enforcement, the judiciary, or the public itself. Over time, his foundation, alongside its growing international partnerships, began to develop strategies that focus on the cultural aspects of justice, starting with early education programs and public awareness campaigns. They developed initiatives to teach young children about their rights, fairness, and the importance of equality, hoping to lay the groundwork for a generation that would demand more of their leaders and their institutions. But for every step forward, there were also setbacks. While the international community had begun to take notice, there remained pockets of resistance. Some of the wealthiest, most powerful individuals in the world, those who were the most aloof from the type of reform Thomas was advocating, became more vocal in their opposition. They attacked the movement, often accusing Thomas and his colleagues of undermining authority and threatening the very foundation of societal structures. The media, which had once heralded his work, now sometimes turned hostile, with sensationalized stories casting doubt on his methods or questioning his motives. Even with these challenges, Thomas felt more determined than ever to continue his work. There were moments when the weight of the pressure threatened to overwhelm him. The constant scrutiny, the demands for his time, and the internal battles to balance personal life with public responsibility began to take their toll. But in these quiet moments, when he would reflect on the progress that had been made, Thomas found solace in the stories of people whose lives had been touched by his work. It was these stories that kept him going, reminding him why he had started all those years ago. His role in the movement had evolved. He was no longer just an activist. He was now a leader, a mentor, a figurehead for a movement that was larger than any one individual. He knew that the true power of the cause was not in him, but in the thousands of people who had rallied behind the idea of justice. He felt privileged to be the one to have sparked that fire, but he understood that it was the work of many, those who would pick up the mantle and carry it forward, that would shape the future. As the world grew more interconnected, Thomas saw opportunities for collaboration that had never existed before. Technology, once a tool used by those in power to maintain control, had now become an essential part of the movement for justice. Social media platforms, once a source of division and misinformation, were being leveraged to spread awareness, rally support, and create real-time accountability. Activists around the world were using digital tools to document abuses, create networks of support, and demand change in ways that were both immediate and lasting. The Foundation's network expanded rapidly in the digital age. More people could now access the resources and support they needed to challenge corruption or wrongful convictions. There were online platforms where individuals could report injustices anonymously, and the Foundation had created digital toolkits for those who wanted to initiate their own local campaigns for transparency. These innovations meant that the movement was no longer confined to physical borders, and the fight for justice was truly global. But even as technology provided new avenues for change, it also brought new challenges. The rise of digital surveillance, cyber attacks, and the misuse of personal data posed significant threats to the movement. In some countries, governments cracked down on online activists, making it harder for those speaking out to remain anonymous or safe. As technology became a tool for empowerment, it also became a weapon for those who sought to maintain the status quo. Thomas, however, never wavered. He worked tirelessly to ensure that the movement adapted, creating strategies to safeguard activists and whistleblowers in the digital age. He knew that each victory in the fight for justice came with its own set of challenges, but he also understood that it was those very challenges that kept the movement alive, pushing it to evolve and grow stronger. As his work continued to take him to every corner of the globe, he found that no matter where he went, the core message of justice was universal. Whether he was speaking to a small group in a rural town or addressing a crowd of thousands in a major city, the principle remained the same. Justice should be available to all, regardless of status, wealth, or background. In his talks, he spoke not just about the importance of fairness within the system, but also about the need for empathy, understanding, and a deep respect for human dignity. Yet, even as Thomas's influence continued to grow, he found himself facing an ever-deepening internal conflict. The more progress the movement made, the more he was reminded that systemic change often takes years, even decades, to come to fruition. The injustices he fought against, corruption, discrimination, and inequality, were vast and deeply ingrained, and the road to addressing them would never be short or easy. He felt both the weight of progress and the burden of knowing that the world was far from the just place he had dreamed of. He began to see that the path ahead would require not just persistence, but also deep flexibility, the ability to adapt to a changing world. The solutions that worked yesterday might not be effective tomorrow, and Thomas knew that if the movement was to continue, it would need to innovate, evolve, and respond to the challenges of each new era. This ever-shifting landscape was both exhilarating and daunting, but Thomas had always believed that the pursuit of justice was not a destination. It was a journey, one that required constant effort and an unwavering commitment to the ideals that had guided him from the start. Though his life's work was far from over, Thomas had come to realize that he could never rest. There would always be new challenges, new battles to fight, and new voices that needed to be heard. But as long as the fight continued, as long as people were willing to stand up for justice, he knew he would have a place within it, whether leading the charge or quietly supporting those who would lead it in the future. The cause had become much bigger than one man or one movement. It had become a force that would shape the future of justice for generations to come. The years rolled on, and with each passing day, the world seemed to shift just a little bit closer to the ideals Thomas had once dared to imagine. His foundation, now an institution in its own right, continued to advocate for justice in ways that few could have predicted. But as the movement expanded, so did the challenges, each one more complicated and nuanced than the last. While the mission of accountability and transparency remained as important as ever, Thomas began to realize that justice was not a single battle, but an unceasing war, a war fought on multiple fronts and with many different tactics. The tactics had changed over time, from protests in the streets to diplomatic negotiations in plush government offices. Technology had introduced new tools for engagement, and social movements had gone global. Yet the resistance to change remained deeply entrenched. The power structures that perpetuated inequality and corruption had grown adept at adapting, sometimes co-opting the very tools used to challenge them. Despite these obstacles, the movement had not slowed. Grassroots campaigns, now amplified by social media, were sprouting up in even the most repressive corners of the world. Young people who had grown up in a globalized world were joining in droves, bringing with them new perspectives and new ways of thinking about justice. They were less patient than the generations before them, more likely to demand action now, and less willing to accept slow, incremental change. They were determined to hold the powerful accountable, and they had the platforms and networks to make their voices heard. Thomas, who had once been the face of the movement, now found himself in the background, supporting the new generation of leaders. It was a strange transition, one he hadn't fully prepared for, but he had always believed in the importance of empowering others. The young people who came to him for advice were no longer looking for a mentor so much as they were looking for allies in their fight. And Thomas, though weary at times, was eager to offer his experience. But the work was becoming harder in some ways. As the movement grew, it began to attract not just support but also hostility. Powerful individuals and corporations, threatened by the shift in the global landscape, began to push back, organizing their own networks to discredit the movement and its goals. They launched campaigns to sow division, to frame the conversation in a way that undermined the credibility of the reformers. The media, once a supportive ally, became more fractured in its reporting, and news outlets began to take sides, further polarizing public opinion. Yet, despite the resistance, the momentum was undeniable. More and more governments, recognizing the power of public opinion, began to enact reforms. Slowly but steadily, policies started to change, though often in fits and starts, and not without fierce opposition. Legal systems, long entrenched in corruption, began to see the first signs of true accountability. Police forces, once untouchable in their abuses, were now under greater scrutiny. Whistleblowers, once silenced, found more avenues for support and protection. But Thomas knew that the work was never done. Each victory was met with a new challenge, and each challenge brought with it fresh obstacles to overcome. Still, his resolve did not waver. He understood now that justice was not a finite goal. It was a process, one that required constant vigilance and an ever-evolving strategy. And it was this understanding that helped him continue his work with passion. He saw the small victories, the incremental changes, as the markers of progress. A society that valued justice, he realized, wasn't one that had achieved perfection. It was one that continued to strive for it, no matter how difficult the path. But as much as he had accomplished, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play, something beyond his grasp. It was as if the movement had taken on a life of its own, evolving in directions he could never have anticipated. Sometimes, he would reflect on the early days of his journey and wonder if he had truly understood what he was starting. He had set out to change the world, but what he had discovered was a far more complex and tangled web of human history, of power, and of deep-seated injustice that couldn't be unraveled with simple solutions. With every new case, with every new investigation, he found himself questioning the nature of justice itself. Could it ever truly be achieved in a world so full of inequality? Was it possible to create a system where everyone was treated fairly, when the very structures of society were built upon centuries of imbalance? These were questions he had asked before, but they seemed to resonate more deeply now. As the movement continued to grow, so did its challenges. What had once been a singular fight against injustice had become a vast, multifaceted mission, one that was pushing the boundaries of what was possible. And in this vast sea of change, Thomas found himself once again standing at the crossroads, uncertain of the direction, but steadfast in his belief that the fight was worth it. The road ahead was filled with unknowns. The next phase of his journey would undoubtedly bring new obstacles, new challenges, and new opportunities. But no matter what, Thomas knew that the battle for justice would continue, driven by a collective force of people who would never give up, who would never settle for the status quo. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself to believe that the world might just be ready for real, lasting change. Yet, even as he looked toward the future, Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger transformation. The foundations were being laid, the groundwork for a better, more just world. The fight was long, and the road ahead would be filled with twists and turns, but the course had been set. The movement was unstoppable, and whether he was leading it or simply supporting it from the sidelines, Thomas knew he would continue to stand for justice, for equality, and for the power of the... As the years went by, the movement continued to evolve, and the results of Thomas's tireless efforts began to take root. The world was not yet perfect, far from it, but changes were undeniable. Laws were rewritten, institutions reformed, and the voices of those who had once been silenced were now echoing through the halls of power. The systemic injustices that had plagued society for so long were being chipped away, and though the progress was slow, the momentum was undeniable. Thomas, who had once questioned whether true justice could ever be achieved, began to see the fruits of his labor. The work was still far from done, but there was a sense of accomplishment in the air. The people he had mentored and the movements he had helped build were now leading the charge. They were creating policies, pushing through reforms, and demanding accountability in ways that Thomas had only dreamed of at the outset. He began to feel the weight of his influence, the weight of the countless lives touched by his work. Every victory, every shift in policy was a testament to the power of persistent, collective action. He looked around at the people in his life, at his colleagues, activists, and the young leaders who had taken on the mantle of reform. And for the first time, he felt a deep sense of peace. Not because the fight was over, but because it had evolved into something larger than himself. It was no longer just about him or his foundation. It was about a movement, a shared belief in the possibility of a better world. But as with all movements, the fight for justice was not a linear one. There would always be new challenges, new systems of power to dismantle, and new battles to fight. Yet, Thomas realized that the most important change had already taken place, not in the laws, not in the systems, but in the hearts and minds of the people. People were no longer passive in the face of injustice. They were active participants in creating the world they wanted to live in, demanding transparency, accountability, and fairness in every corner of the globe. And in that realization, Thomas understood something vital. The real power of justice was not just in the reforms it brought, but in the change it ignited within individuals. It was about creating a society where people no longer accepted the status quo, where the fight for what was right never ceased. It was about the perpetual pursuit of justice, an effort that, once started, would continue indefinitely, fueled by the collective will of people who believed in a world where fairness and equality were not privileges, but rights. Years passed, and Thomas, now an elder statesman in the world of justice reform, continued his work, but in a different capacity. His role had shifted once again, from leader to advisor, from revolutionary to observer. But his spirit, his determination, and his belief in the cause had not waned. He had become part of the fabric of the movement, not because of any single action, but because of the values he had instilled in others. The day came when Thomas stood before a new generation of reformers, people who had grown up with the ideals he had fought for their entire lives. They had known a world where justice was a given, where corruption was rare and systems of inequality were being dismantled. They were building upon the foundation Thomas and his colleagues had laid, and they were moving forward with energy and purpose. And as Thomas looked out at the faces of those who would continue the fight, he felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. He had not only witnessed change, he had been a part of it. He had helped build a movement that had transformed the world, and now it was in the hands of those who would carry it into the future. The fight was not over, of course. There would always be work to be done, challenges to face, and new injustices to confront. But as Thomas stood there, surrounded by the next wave of change makers, he knew that the movement would carry on long after he was gone. The torch had been passed, and the flame of justice burned brighter than ever. As he walked away from the podium, ready to return to his quiet life, Thomas felt a deep, lasting peace. He had given everything to the cause, and in doing so, had helped create a world that was just a little bit better. It was not perfect, but it was enough, and that, he realized, was all anyone could ever truly hope for. The world had changed, and though the journey was far from over, Thomas had helped lead the way. The fight for justice had not just been about the pursuit of fairness. It had been about transforming the very essence of society itself. It was a journey that would continue long after his time. For justice, once ignited, was a flame that could never be extinguished. And with that thought, Thomas faded into the background, knowing that the world would keep turning. The movement would keep pushing forward, and the fight for justice would never truly end.